This is an example of developer commentary. We want to give you as much freedom as possible so you can noodle around and play the game while commentary is active. You can enable and disable subtitles in the commentary menu or using this switch up here. You can stop commentary at any time by reactivating this commentary node or through the menu. From time to time, we show recordings of gameplay in order to illustrate the conversation. By default, these appear up in the corner of the screen, but if you desire, you can toggle them to full screen to see things better. When you do that, the game is paused. You can shrink the recording again to resume your own gameplay. We just did this automatically, but we'll let this recording go on for a while so you can try maximizing and minimizing for yourself. Often there will be illustrations which are treated the same way. You can maximize them for best visibility or minimize them if you just want to play the game. When a commentary is done and you go on to the next one, the new illustrations appear in whichever mode you left the last. We've touched up the graphics and sound for this edition of Braid, but if you want to play with the original graphics and sound, you can switch at any time. These are the old graphics, and these are the new graphics. The commentary world is all new, so there are no old graphics to switch to when you're back there. It only works here in the main game. So, you want to design a video game. You're sitting down with a blank screen on your computer and just a vague idea. You want to make a platformer game with puzzles about rewinding time. In order to make anything, you need answers to some fundamental questions. It's a platformer. Who's the character? Human or some kind of animal mascot? How big is he? How fast does he move? What's the scale of the world? How big are levels horizontally and vertically? How much can you see on the screen at once? You can change your answers later, But before you can start building levels, you need an initial guess. And this initial guess is important because it determines how development is going to go. If you guess too wrong, you might never see the ideas that lead to the best version of your game because the territory you're exploring is too far from those ideas. Braid's startup behavior was unusual at the time and remains so even today. When Braid starts up, it drops you straight into gameplay in a level which also serves as the title screen but is playable. Then, as now, most video games displayed one or more splash screens presenting developer or publisher logos. Then they take you to a main menu where you can choose to start a game. Then maybe you get to pick some options. And this is often pointless because you don't really know what to pick because you haven't played the game yet, so you don't really know what the options are going to do. The initial motivation for this puzzle began with the vision of things being rewound very quickly. And in this game, the objects beside the player that can move of their own accord are usually hostile. They're bullets, they're monsters, rabbits, and whatnot. And so the image is of a bunch of these flying around as you rewind very quickly. And why are they flying around? Well, you could just have them flying through space that the player doesn't ever move through, but that seems weird and strange. And it just seems more fun to have the player dodge them. And Braid is often pretty good about making relevant gameplay information visible so that the player is not confused and can successfully solve puzzles. But over the course of development, in order to design puzzles, some configurable behavior was added to some entities that was invisible. Essentially, these are hidden variables that actually matter to gameplay. I was unsure how to address these visually at the time because the design decisions were so in flux, it seemed like they might change completely. And also, early ideas about how to visualize these pieces of information seemed heavyweight and maybe more confusing than helpful. Ultimately, these cases were left unhandled, but in retrospect, I'd like it more if I had done something there. The most impactful hidden variable is that each cannon that fires monsters has a limit of how many live monsters are. Braid starts up directly to this screen, and the music for this level is the first thing that players hear. I think of this opening as one of the signature moments of the game, but it's pretty different from what I originally imagined. From the start of development, I had a picture of the mood and feel I wanted the game to have that was contrary to what most games had done. I wanted World 4 to have a feel that matches the rest of the game in basic situations. You run around and jump and climb at the same speed as in other worlds. Then we use your motion to drive the advancement of time for everything else in the level. So first, we run our simulation step for only the player, holding the rest of the world constant. This gives us a value, delta x0, the amount by which the player moves in the x direction if the rest of the world were totally still. Most of the time, it's very simple from there. If we want to know how much time should pass for the rest of the world, we just take delta x0 and multiply it by some factor f that we use to determine how much time passes for each unit moved in space. This constant is arbitrary. We can turn it up or down, and time will move faster or slower relative to your own motion. We'll call the amount of time that passes as a result of this conversion delta t0. Delta t0 is just delta x0 times f. Now we're concerned with a special case. What if the player is standing on something that's moving? As we mentioned, the movement of whatever he's standing on should carry. Once I had decided on the basic way this world works, that the player would go forward in time, while all the gameplay objects would go backward in time of their own accord, there remained a big question about how to make this actually happen in the code. Since the gameplay engine of Braid is all about recording the history of objects and playing them back later on, the most obvious idea is to use that same code just to make everything go backwards. During development time, you would set up a level with monsters and whatever else, and you just let it play with time going forward and record the history of that, just like we do for normal rewinding. Then, when someone is actually playing the game, you load that recorded history and play it backward, and the player is just exempted from that rewind and simulates forward normally. This was the first thing I thought of, and immediately I felt it just wouldn't be very good. Because you When confronted with the fact that reversal didn't work perfectly, so that monsters flung into the air by these markers did not reach exactly the place they came from when recording the markers, the ideal thing to do would have been to keep working on the simulation code until the reversal worked perfectly. But when you're overwhelmed by the number of things to do to finish a game, and the simulation code is already pretty complicated because it has to support all kinds of different rules from all the different worlds, it can seem much more appealing just to do the quick fix. And
in the original Braid game, there were no ambient sounds except for, I think, 2 levels that had a simple rain loop. And there wasn't any sound of Tim moving around, so most of the time there's only music and some specific gameplay sounds. So in that sense, Braid is a good example of very simplistic or minimalistic game audio, which is you only hear the sound effects that serve a direct purpose of communicating stuff that happens in gameplay, like a cannon shooting or a door opening or a platform moving. And then also the sounds that give So, a little bit about the cloud cannons and the fuses. Originally this world was very silent with only music playing, no rain and almost no cloud cannons. The cloud cannons had a very faint and abstract poof when shooting, and an almost inaudible sound when the clouds disappeared. And in our opinion, these sounds did not really connect well with the actual cannons. We wanted to create a much richer and more forceful sound that could give the cannons some weight but also some beauty, and that the player would instinctively understand as coming from the cannons. We also felt that
these are excerpts from an interview of Braid's primary visual artist, David Hellman, conducted by Frank Cifaldi of the video game History Foundation.
What I would do was kind of work with one brush a lot of the time, and that changed a bit which one I was using, but I'd work with one brush that was like a round brush with a very simple shape, or maybe like a little bit of texture, a little bit of grain on it, or like sometimes I was using a brush with a canvas texture that a lot of people noticed in the original Braid. I'm using one brush and its opacity is set to like 60 to 75%. And as I go, I'm sampling with the eyedropper. So I'm sampling locally, painting transparently, and then sampling again. So I'm getting more subdivisions of color. And so that's kind of how I worked on it.
And when you revisited it, did you go back to your old techniques to make sure you were sort of being true to Braid, or did you have new techniques to come up with sort of similar aesthetics?
I think I did largely the same thing. I was working, actually, I did the new Braid art mostly in Procreate on my iPad, which I was using for a long time. So a little bit different workflow, but yeah, very similar ultimately. This world progresses excitingly towards more activity, more chaos. But from here, you don't know that. You just see, it looks like, post some kind of destruction, but it's quiet, I think. It's like there's not too much activity. We're just looking at some rubble in the background and a kind of hazy atmosphere.
Are there elements of past stages here?
Yeah, I think it was John's idea to have this world be kind of a mashup of other worlds, like they were all colliding together.
It is December 18th, 2023. We're getting ready for Christmas. We are here to talk about the gritty reality of game development when you're independent. And would you like to introduce yourself? How do you want people to know you?
Okay, so I am Daniel Benmergui. I'm also an independent game developer from Argentina. I made a game called Storyteller, which is at this point in time the game I'm most well known for.
Yeah, and so we thought we would talk a little bit, maybe about other topics, but maybe also about the business realities. Why don't I start? So I had an idea of an experience that I wanted the player to have at the start of the game.
Okay.
Just an art thing. Like, wouldn't it be nice?
I'm looking at the original screenshot of the first screen of Braid that John put together. I'm looking for the words because I can.
So the house, well, I'd had this idea that if it's a puzzle game, I think the idea that you would be able to trivially run through the levels came much later. But before that, it was like, okay, these levels are going to have puzzles. I had done enough looking at games. So I didn't want it to be like a story-based game in the way lots of games are, where it's about the narrative or something. Those
Right.
people drove me nuts,
Right.
like even back then.
Right.
But I like the idea. Okay, so it's some kind of hybrid. I want to have some writing and I want to have some gameplay. What does that look like? Well, you know, one of the levels that shows up again in the game a few times is this level called the Pit.
Yeah, I was going to ask
And
about
it's
that one.
super. It's one of the most minimal. It's
Yeah, and
literally
it's
one
beautiful.
screen,
Yeah.
and there's a pit.
Yeah.
And then what can we do with
And it
that,
happens
right?
like 5 times too, which is great.
Yeah. And so that in the original prototype of the game, that was the level where I introduced the magic key. And the magic key was the